Welcome to the world of survival horror. Resident Evil, known as Biohazard in Japan, has always held a special place in my heart. It's shaped how I see horror media, and especially horror video games. I was too young to properly understand what survival horror was or that horror gaming had multiple subgenres in general, but I knew that I loved the title. Biohazard is one of the most important gaming franchises of all time. It's been nearly 3 decades since Capcom released this absolute banger of a game, evolving the gaming landscape with its innovation and changes in direction. Today I'm going to be doing a deep dive into this series that I love, starting with the first release and its eventual remake. So, without further ado, let's get right into it. It all started on January 21st, 1989, when the horror film Sweet Home was released into Japanese theaters. Later that year, Capcom put out a tie-in game of the same title to be played on the Nintendo Entertainment System. This game was an RPG that used limited inventory slots, puzzles, and terrifying imagery to cement a feeling of unease in the player. But you might be asking, why are you bringing up this game? Well, Resident Evil would never have been created if it weren't for the existence of Sweet Home. Capcom initially came to Shinji Mikami to create a remake of Sweet Home for the SNES. There was one problem though. Capcom didn't have the rights to actually do this, since the game was a tie-in for a pre-existing movie, and the license they had no longer applied. So, instead of creating an actual remake, Mikami decided to create a spiritual successor, taking elements from the original game and creating something new out of it. That's where certain elements of the first Biohazard come from. The labyrinth of a mansion, the various puzzles, limited inventory slots, and even some of the cleverly placed door animations. Initially, RE1 was supposed to have more ghostly enemies in a similar vein to Sweet Home, but Mikami's other influences shine through in this department, giving the title its own identity. Mikami wanted the enemies to be something closer to the human form rather than the spirits and ghouls that were initially drafted for the game. Shinji's love for George Romero's Dawn of the Dead took him down the path of using zombified corpses as the threat for Biohazard. Yes, I thought, zombies. At the time, I recalled the film Dawn of the Dead. I loved that film. It was unfortunate, as far as the audience was concerned, that they couldn't survive. But with a game, the players could use their own techniques and thinking in order to survive the experience. I thought that this difference between horror games and horror movies could be something wonderful. That was the moment when I conceived Biohazard. There were a few other major influences when creating this game. The Shining's Overlook Hotel was a large influence when it came to the mansion's interior design. Yotsuya Kaiden, a Japanese ghost story, also influenced the narrative a bit, with its impact on Mikami's younger self shaping the game. All of these factors helped to decide how the final product turned out, with both sci-fi and traditional horror elements being seen. Initially, Mikami was a one-man army putting together ideas and developing RE1. This went on for about 6 months until Koshi Oda began helping him. Oda eventually left the project, having other things he needed to work on. Though, shortly after this, Shinji Mikami had an entire team of developers to help him. At first it was 15, then the project grew to around 50 people in total. RE1 was first envisioned as a first-person shooter in the style of rip and tear simulator. But this vision was hindered by limitations of the PS1. Mikami has said that this version of the game got decently far into development, although there's not a lot of visual representations of this prototype. The only thing we know of currently is a single piece of concept art. The same goes for the over-the-shoulder third-person perspective that was tried out a little later in production. Although this idea would go on to shape games such as Resident Evil Spain Slaughter and Resident Evil Africa Slaughter. You can refer to them as 4 and 5, but I feel like Spain and Africa Slaughter are more apt titles. To begin with, there seems to have been 4 playable characters: Dewey, Gelzer, Chris, and Jill. The cast of characters we know today went through quite a bit of development and evolution before they reached the final product. The concept art we have, depending on the character, is somewhat limited, but based on what we do have, we can get a good idea of what the game could have been like through its production. It's likely that since Capcom didn't expect this game to do well, they didn't save a lot of the concept art for it, but you know, that's just a theory. Dewey, a comic relief character, was completely cut from the game. Gelzer was a big, brawny cyborg guy who most likely evolved into the ultimate zaddy Barry Burton. The more in-depth character concept art for Chris and Jill gives us a more clear view of what the character designers had in mind for these characters. The action-y orientation of the game during this period was reflected in their designs. There's an iteration of Jill completely clad in green military getup, and another that has a more sleek femme fatale approach. This is all before her more police uniform-inspired look was chosen. Chris's various iterations weren't really as drastic, with most of them keeping somewhat similar color schemes and design, although one of them veers more toward the direction of Final Fantasy VII rather than survival horror. You've also got some doodles that I'm pretty sure are also from the RE1 team, that flesh out the final characters a bit more. At some point during this period of character development, the game designers settled on a fixed camera perspective for gameplay. Depending on the area you traverse through, the camera would change directions, showing the player what they needed to see at that moment. This change in path would also come at the time that Mikami felt that the game was too sci-fi oriented, and he decided to focus more on the horror aspects. This allowed a wide range of possibilities. To start off, Capcom Production Studio 4 was able to use the pre-rendered backgrounds that we know it for, allowing for a higher graphical fidelity, since everything wasn't being rendered real-time through 3D models. It might not look nice by modern standards, but at the time, this made every game reviewer and PS1 player lose their minds. Biohazard is legitimately one of the best looking games for the PS1, hands down. Although, around this time, the team of game developers started to lose faith in the project, and there are even some members who completely dropped out of the game. Going down this route provided the necessary groundwork for Mikami to realize his vision for Biohazard. The best art is often created through limitation. The limitation of the time's technology allowed for the Biohazard team at Capcom to pioneer an entirely new genre and a whole new style of presentation. The pre-rendered backgrounds partially shaped the identity of the original Resident Evil trilogy. Speaking of the game's identity, there's quite a bit to cover in that regard. This title is the peak of B-movie horror goodness. Pretty much everything, from the voice acting to the live-action cutscenes in the beginning of the game. Everything about this just oozes with that distinct feeling. Now, is it good? Nope. That's what makes it interesting though. Let me explain. There are aspects of this game that are just notoriously bad. I mentioned the voice acting earlier, but that's because it's absolutely garbage, but in an endearing way. With weirdly written lines such as,
"That was too close. You were almost a Jill sandwich."
Resident Evil's writing and voice performances have been drilled into the minds of survival horror fans everywhere. This contributes to that feeling like you're watching a trashy B-movie. These sorts of films always have really goofy or outlandish plots, funny dialogue, and subpar acting. But this is what makes them fun and interesting to watch. The same applies to Resident Evil 1. The unsettling yet still goofy opening cutscene tells you everything you need to know about the experience you're gonna have when booting up the game. Then the cheesy 90s horror narrator voice that announces the game's title just solidifies it all.
Resident Evil.
Towards the end of development, the gaming public started to get glimpses of the final product. At one point, there seems to have been a co-op mode and some sort of graveyard area. These things obviously got removed from the final game, but I theorize that the double storyline between Chris and Jill is a remnant of the co-op game mechanics. But this has never been confirmed to my knowledge. This decision was likely for the better, since the feeling of loneliness enhances the horror elements. The cut environmental elements made their reappearance in the remake for RE1 that got released to the GameCube. If you want to hear more about that, then stick around and sub to the channel so you're notified when I release more content. Other than these things, there aren't a ton of known differences between this prototype version of the game and what we got in the end. Some slight differences in enemy and boss placement, but other than that, there's not much known about the late period of development. The original story of the game would have given the player a lot more information about the mansion's history, but due to some time or hardware restraints, the content was cut. Again, this stuff reappears in the 2002 remake, holding more to Mikami's original vision. There are slight visual differences as well, door animations being textured differently, items being placed slightly different. The majority of these differences just came down to polish though. It seems as if Mikami and his team spent a lot of the later end of the development cycle polishing the visuals and gameplay. It's pretty admirable that this was put together with this level of quality on a console that came out before I was even born in the span of a year and a half. Then there's the part that's very near and dear to my heart, and that's the live action cutscenes. These are terrible, and that's what makes them amazing. Some of the actors didn't even want their names associated with this masterpiece, and I don't blame them. Nobody knew who Rebecca Chambers or Jill's actresses even were for the longest time. There are some other videos you can watch about this subject from other creators. I'll link them down in the description below. I think that the best part is that they couldn't find a blonde actor to play Wesker, so they had to just moose this random guy's hair and dye it stark blonde. It's not as noticeable in the PS1 cutscene because it's in black and white for censorship, but if you play the PC or Japanese releases of the game, you get all that mustard-haired greatness. Let it grace your eyes, you know you wanna. The way these guys run through this field is the dumbest thing ever, although a lot of the editing, lighting, and effects are legitimately unsettling. There's so much bad, but there's also so much good, and that's just what makes it interesting. Then we get the best part, and that's the introduction sequence. It's short, so I'm just gonna let it play out. Nothing I'd say can possibly convey this masterpiece to you.
Chris Redfield. Jill Valentine. Barry Burton. Rebecca Chambers. Albert Wesker. Resident Evil.
And with that, a gaming legend was born. Tokoro Fujiwara, the man who selected Shinji Mikami to be the game's creator, estimated that the game would sell about 200,000 copies. But to the astonishment of everyone at Capcom, the game was a bestseller. It received praise from gamers and critics alike. As of the making of this video, Resident Evil has sold 1.1 million copies on its initial release, and then upon its re-release a year later, it sold 1.2 million. Definitely not the failure that Capcom expected it to be. This is a title that made every kid in the 90s completely lose their minds and freak out. Why was it so critically acclaimed? Well, there could be a few reasons for that. Resident Evil felt fresh at the time of its release. Nobody was familiar with survival horror at the time because it wasn't really a thing. The horror genre of gaming wasn't really even a thing. There were games that had certain aspects that could maybe let them be called survival horror, but Biohazard solidified the horror genre in gaming. It showed everyone just what a horror game could be. This was a project with the love and passion of an entire team behind it. This video is going to be the first part of a series. I thought it would be a good idea to break it up into parts. So next I'll be covering the story of Resident Evil 1. I hope you enjoyed the video and that you stick around for more. Remember to hit the like button and subscribe and comment. Give me your thoughts on the video and tell me what you think about Resident Evil. Until I see you again, stay safe.